The Tax Foundation study ranked North Carolina third in corporate taxes among all states, 16th in income, 20th in sales. We got a little ways to go, ranked 33rd in property. But I think that those rankings sound a little bit high to me, and that is due in part because of the recent reforms in the last few years. But notice that those reforms cover income, corporate, and property taxes. It's a little bit, to a little extent, also sales taxes. They don't cover the specific topic for today, which is called selective taxes, more colloquially known as sin taxes. And so what we find in this other category is maybe North Carolina has some work to do still. And maybe North Carolina has some work to do in granting the good intentions behind our public policies, but not ending there with good intentions, but also including going from there to talk about the actual consequences and the actual impacts that public policies have, especially on marginalized communities. So to sort of set the tone a little bit, because we're mostly economists up here, I want to share with you a little bit. See, I'm not teaching this week, and I miss it, so I gotta talk a little bit about some economics. This is a book first published in 1890 by Alfred Marshall, who was the towering figure in economics for about 4 decades around the turn of the century. And Alfred Marshall talks about a lot of things in this textbook, but one thing he talks about is taxation. I'm just going to take a moment to read very briefly from Marshall's pages. He says, "For indeed, a great part of economic science is occupied with the diffusion throughout the community of economic changes, which primarily affect some particular branch of production or consumption. And there is scarcely any economic principle which cannot be aptly illustrated by a discussion of the shifting effects of some tax, including selective taxes, including sin taxes." So what Marshall is getting at here, I think, is twofold. The first thing is that he's pointing out the ability of ordinary people to shift the effects of a tax, even a well-intentioned tax, away from those intended effects that might not be anticipated by the policymakers who created that policy, nor intended by the voters who elected those policymakers. Secondly, the ability of economic analysis, the rest of the pages in his book, and many since then, to identify these unintended consequences in a specific way, and to use sound economics to unpack those unintended consequences. Economics is more than about numbers and statistics. Economics provides us a method for analyzing the effectiveness and the desirability of public policies. Alfred Marshall knew that when he was writing 130 some years ago, and our distinguished and excellent panelists know that today. So I'm happy to turn the podium over and do just as you and the audience will do and enjoy their remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed, for the great introduction. And on behalf of my fellow panelists, I certainly want to thank the John Locke Foundation, Western Carolina Center for the Study of Free Enterprise, and the Federalist Society for hosting us today. All right, so as has been indicated thus far, our book certainly concerns selective taxation. And Adam and I were really honored to be able to bring together 25 academic scholars who really spend their entire career writing and researching these topics, right? And so the overall goal of the book for Adam and I was really to better inform the debate of what is good public policy, right? And so we're not really trying to challenge what is the role of government. Should there be nudges necessarily? We're addressing, okay, well, let's at least concede that to some degree. We'll hold that to another debate, whether the role of government is to actually engage in nudges. We comment on those aspects a little bit, but really then to follow up, well, does the policy actually carry out the goals that have been stated, right? And what sort of other costs these side consequences, unintended consequences, ultimately result. Right, so the book really has three, I guess, sub-goals, right? So first is we start off really trying to describe why do politicians tend to, at least at the state and local level, tend to favor selective taxes above and beyond the more economically efficient broad-based taxes, such as the income tax, such as a true broad-based sales tax without so many exemptions. And then second is looking at, we're trying to assess to what degree do these taxes actually, again, carry out the intended goals, and what are the secondary and unintended consequences. And then lastly, as one of the things that Adam, I think, it will address in cleanup today, we'll address really what are some guidelines about how we can improve some of our tax policy. Right, so some of you may question, why do we have a pretty substantially sized book all on selective taxes, right? And so really, state and local politicians are under quite a bit of pressure to find new tax revenues, sources of tax revenue. And that could be partially due to increases in expenditures, right? But it's also partially due to decreases in intergovernmental grants from the federal government, leaving the responsibility for their current expenses down to the states. Right? And so states and local governments are under pressure to find revenue. Unfortunately for them, and I guess even more so for us, the broad-based taxes are politically risky. Again, like the politicians, elected officials are elected. And so ultimately, if we see that they need to increase tax revenue, imposing a tax on all the constituents, all the potential voters in your district, is not necessarily a winning prospect. Right? And so selective taxes really provide an opportunity for the elected officials to tax in many cases, a very small segment of the voting population. And then also be able to craft a nice message to say, oh, well, we're not only raising revenue, but we're also improving people's lives because it's nudging them toward more healthy behavior, or it's helping them to change their behavior in ways to reduce the impact on the environment, or a whole host of aspects. Right? So it's really about minimizing opposition to the tax while also gaining a lot of support simultaneously through these selective taxes. And that's a common theme throughout the book, whether we're talking about cigarette taxes, we're talking about the Affordable Care Act. There's a whole host of taxes that were buried into that 1,000-plus page document. Again, it comes down to finding ways to minimize opposition to new tax revenue while also gaining support for the tax itself. Right? Unfortunately, these taxes tend to fall far short of a lot of their promises. Right? And in many cases, as can be argued, especially with the cigarette tax, and more so with anecdotal evidence to this point, the so-called single-use plastic bag taxes and bans could actually worsen outcomes. Right? So could potentially worsen the health effects of those who continue to smoke, and could potentially worsen some of the environmental concerns with bags themselves. Right? Second is really these selective taxes tend to be an unreliable method to raise revenue for specific expenditure areas. Right? So one of the chapters that Adam that he co-authored does concern the role of earmarks. Right? And so there's a lot of cases where we see that there are taxes that are earmarked. So this revenue, or a certain portion of the revenue gained or raised by the particular tax, is then dedicated to a certain expenditure area. In many cases, that really just means that some of the funds that were used from the general fund are now just freed up. It's more of a displacement factor rather than actually raising overall expenditure in that area. And so ultimately, it ends up indirectly raising the revenue available for some of the other really special interest expenditures that exist. And then lastly, selective taxes tend to be highly discriminatory, in particular to the poor. Right? And one of the aspects that Craig will talk about is looking at some of the ability to have some tax shifting. And so if you look at cigarettes, look at alcohol, gambling taxes, a lot of these taxes that we tend to impose as sin taxes these are items that the poor actually consume at a much higher level, at least as a percentage of their income. And if you think about having a doubling or a tripling of a household income, that doesn't lead to double or triple the amount of consumption of cigarettes. And so even if those that are below the poverty line consume the same number of packs of cigarettes, it's a higher percentage of their income that's being spent on cigarettes and the taxes that are being imposed on them. And so these taxes tend to be quite regressive. And it's not just limited to cigarettes. Again, it's largely across the board. Right? Right, so again, as Ed indicated, the book itself I think is really of interest to North Carolinians because, again, the state gets really good rankings in a lot of these state climate or state business climate indices that exist. I know Ed talked about some of the sub-indices from the Tax Foundation ranking. If you combine those to an overall ranking, the state in North Carolina ranks 12th overall. That's almost top 20%. And it's pretty good. Indiana, where I now live, is number 11. But both of these states, Indiana and North Carolina, tend to be really not so good in the area of paternalism. So using these tax code in a paternalistic nature. And in particular, in our book, the second to last chapter of the book has a paternalism index. The first one that's been developed by Russ Sobel and Josh Hall. And North Carolina ranks 33rd. Right? There's a lot of room for growth there. It's roughly 21st or 22nd in the area of use of selective taxes. But if you look at, in particular, the restrictions and bans, so in other words, using the tax code and bans to really almost kind of like with a stick, kind of force people or really hard nudge them into a particular direction in terms of their behavior, North Carolina tends to be quite abusive in that nature. Right, so, and in particular, the bans and restrictions, the state ranks 38th overall. Right? And so, again, there's room for improvement. And in Indiana, I believe, is not much better in that overall ranking in paternalism either. So there does tend to be the states that tend to have better rankings in terms of business climate, tax business climate, also tend to suffer a little bit in some of the paternalistic nature. Right. So I mentioned earlier that the taxes are used to minimize some of the selective taxes are used to minimize opposition to the tax while also raising some of the support. Let me actually use the cigarette tax as an example. I know this is an area where North Carolina is not particularly, doesn't perform particularly poorly, right? At a per pack tax of, I believe, still 45 cents per pack. It's far below the national average at the state level. However, I think that there's probably at least some murmurs of some pressure to try to increase that tax, as there is really across the nation. Right, so if you look at the cigarette tax, so in terms of, again, minimizing the opposition, nationally 15% of the population smoke. Right, so if I need to raise some addition, if I'm an elected official, I need to try to raise some revenue, taxing 15% of the population through this selective tax, even if I have to do so relatively heavily, as you see in, say, New York City, where Thad lives, where the state tax is $4.35. The city tax is another $1.50. The federal tax is another $1. You're paying $6.86 before you even pay for the pack of cigarettes in New York City. In Chicago, it's $7.17 per pack. Right? There are some districts across the country that are heavily taxing these items. You can buy a pack of cigarettes, I'm guessing, for cheaper than the taxes. You can buy it cheaper, paying for the taxes and the cigarettes themselves here in North Carolina, I'm guessing cheaper than what the taxes cost in either Chicago or New York. Right? So how do we get to that point where taxes on these items are raised to that level? Again, it comes down to this warm, fuzzy argument. Right? So, we want people to be healthier. Notice it's no longer that it's healthier for themselves. It's no longer really seems to be about the externality, the cost that by smoking, the secondhand smoke cost that I impose on others. It's now become what we call an internality issue. Well, I'm behaving in a certain way that imposes cost on myself, and in particular health. And so smokers are being told that, well, you're just not smart enough to figure it out that what you're doing is bad for your health. I don't think there's anybody any adult that probably actually doesn't understand that cigarettes are not good for your health at this stage. But our tax code is treating it as if we don't understand that, at least the arguments that are being made. And so, I have some research that shows that, well, honestly, imposing these taxes does reduce some smoking. However, it also changes what people are smoking. So there's always this question of, well, if not this, if we're discouraging this action, what are they doing instead? Right? So those that do continue smoking, so normally it's just a reduction in the number of packs per day or packs per week that an individual smokes. So typically they're still smoking, they just don't smoke as many sticks. But they are making a different adjustment as well. They're adjusting on a quality factor as well. And so quality in cigarettes is flavor. So they're going toward cigarettes that tend to be more flavorful. The flavor comes from tar. Right? And so the more tar there is in the cigarette, the more flavor. But notice it's also the tar that does the damage to an individual's lungs. And so they're smoking fewer packs of cigarettes, but these packs of cigarettes have more tar in each stick, and they tend to take deeper breaths, just a behavioral factor, to try to get the same level of overall nicotine that they had in their system before they reduced their consumption of cigarettes. And so for some folks, it's possible that their health is actually worse as a result of the tax. Not everybody, certainly probably not even close to half are actually worse. But it is possible. We need to understand these types of secondary and unintended consequences. The last aspect that I'll get to, because I'm out of time, is with cigarette taxes, there's another unintended consequence that we can get to in Q&A if there's of interest for cigarette smuggling. So state-to-state cigarette smuggling, so individuals are buying in bulk in low tax states, particularly in Virginia now, although North Carolina's played a major role there in the past. And then transporting them in mass quantities to resell in legal markets, but it's illegal to do this, and particularly in North Carolina, in New York City and in Chicago, you'll see these. If a typical minivan, not to try to convince you to actually engage in this activity because it's illegal, a typical minivan, if you fill it up, based on my back-of-the-envelope calculations, if you fill a carton or a minivan up with cartons of cigarettes that you purchased in Virginia and resell them at the going rate in New York City, you would make about $340,000 on one trip, right? This is major, right? So I'll leave it at that at this point and try to catch Craig here before he takes off to go smuggle some cigarettes, apparently. All right, thank you.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, thanks. So my name is Craig Depkin. As I mentioned, I'm at UNC Charlotte, and I'm a sports economist, so I study phonomics. You've heard of Freakonomics. I study phonomics. So our contribution to the book, and I should thank Todd and Adam for putting this together. Thank you. Our contribution to the book is a chapter on taxes for stadiums, mainly for professional sports franchises. And that seems very simple because we all like sports, and well, maybe not everybody. I like sports. I'm a sports economist. I love stadiums. The questions we ask about how are we going to finance these stadiums. So if you're maybe not so much, but I grew up in Georgia, so Atlanta Fulton County Stadium was our home stadium for the Braves and a bunch of other events. It was built in the early 60s for about $18 million. Today's numbers would be about $40 or $50 million. I was in Arlington, Texas for a while, right when the Dallas Cowboys Stadium was being built, and that came out to be about $1.2 billion. So, and the city of Arlington paid about 2/3 of that. And the city of Arlington is about 350,000 people, now about 400,000 people. And how are you going to pay for this stadium? That's a lot of money spread over 30 years. And so what we talk about in our chapter is really just how is it that stadiums are financed, and really more about the incidence of the taxes. So usually, maybe kind of three go-to taxes we can use to finance a stadium. One would be a sales tax, usually a 1/4 cent, maybe 1/10 cent, but usually pretty small. But then the other two go-tos are going to be a hotel tax and a car rental tax. These are very common. And typically a politician will stand up, or the team owner or whoever's in favor of the stadium will say, you know what's going to happen when we have that hotel tax? We're sticking it to the guy from outside. You're not paying for that. It's the guy who came in from outside. He's going to pay the hotel tax. He's going to rent the car and pay the tax. Okay, sounds plausible. And indeed, if I saw somebody taking, writing out their bill or swiping their credit card at the hotel, who's paying for the tax? The person who just stayed in the room. Got that. But in economics, we're not so worried about who's actually paying the dollar tax. That's really not so important. What's important is what's happening in the background, like who is actually bearing the brunt of this tax. So I can just tell you this very quickly. I won't spend all the time going through every tax, but just take the hotel tax. Imagine that the hotel tax actually makes a difference. So somebody who would have stayed here in Raleigh or would have stayed in Charlotte chooses not to. So there are fewer rooms being rented out. The question is, who's bearing the brunt of that? So if there are fewer rooms being rented out, does that mean that the hotelier, that is the hotel owner, doesn't have as much revenue or as much profits? Maybe it's the hotel owner that's being hit with the tax or the impact of the tax. But if there are fewer rooms being rented out, maybe I don't need as many workers, right? I don't need as many employees. I don't need as many maids or as people working in the restaurant. I don't need as many valet parkers. So those individuals who had a job at the hotel might lose their job, right? They don't lose the full job, they lose hours. So maybe those individuals are bearing the brunt. And then maybe the people that supply bars of soap to the hotel, because the hotel is not renting out as many rooms, not as many bars of soap are being used. Now, these are very subtle and nuanced arguments, not something you'd hear a politician talk about, right? Because they're really trying to convince you as a voter to vote for this proposal typically, so that they can stick it to the guy who comes from outside. The same thing happens with car rental. In the case of Arlington, Texas, they put a car rental tax in for the Cowboy Stadium. The interesting thing is that most of the car rentals that we could document actually take place at the airport, the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, which is about 25 miles north of Arlington. It's not part of Arlington. So all the cars are being rented at the DFW airport, not contributing anything to the local taxes for the stadium in Arlington. We did find those that people that live in Arlington that get their car serviced, right? So their car is going to be in the shop for a couple days. They go down to the Enterprise or the Rent-A-Wreck and they rent the car locally. So it turns out the locals are paying the taxes for this. It's not the guy from outside. The guy from outside landed at DFW Airport. He didn't then take an Uber. At the time there was no Uber, but you can imagine you don't take the Uber from the airport to Arlington to rent your car. That kind of sounds silly, right? So what we find, again, what we talk about in our paper is that the incidence of the taxes is what's more important than who's actually paying the tax. Say car rental taxes, sales taxes are also, as Todd was mentioning in his comments, that a sales tax tends to be regressive. That is, it hurts the lower income more so. But we actually talk in our paper as well. It's like you have to think about other dimensions in which incidents could fall. So not just buyer and seller, but it could be mobile versus immobile. So if I have a sales tax and I'm not mobile, so I don't have a car to avoid this tax, that is to drive to the next county or the next city to avoid the tax, then right, the immobile is the one who's going to receive the brunt of the tax. It could be the older versus younger crowd, right? So there's, I need to buy today because my tire just blew out. I need to buy tires today versus I can plan for my tire purchase 6 months from now. So there's all sorts of dimensions in which tax incidence can reveal itself, but they're usually very nuanced, not something that typically in the public discussion you see about it. So economists, we get accused of being nerdy, and that's fine, we do. But we also get paid to sit around and think about these things and go like, wait a second. So the fewer hotel rooms being rented, what does that really mean? As opposed to, well, we have fewer hotel rooms rented, but I might actually get more tax revenue, right, to pay off the stadium. That's really a secondary issue for us. It's more about how it is that that the taxes are being impacted on the local population. See, I talk too fast. That's the problem. I get accused of not being Southern because I talk too fast, but it's usually because I just got to get it out, right? Let's see. Oh, I'll just say this. Also, that's not. He shows me how much time I have. I told him I'll ignore. Yeah, so I'll come back to, so the stadiums are typically justified by, so we can think about the cost, but we think about the benefits of the stadiums themselves. We tend to see that politicians talk about jobs. We talk about maybe higher wages for individuals that work in particular areas. Tourism is a big draw, right? So we have a stadium, people come for tourism purposes. We have amenities. This is a quality of life issue, right? So you have an arena here in Raleigh, there's a hockey team there, and if you like hockey, you can go see a hockey team. In Charlotte, we have a football stadium, so we can go see a football game if we want to. And so that's kind of the general amenity. Then there's this civic pride, right, that you're a major league city. And I always joke, like, I've been on airplanes all the time, and I don't walk around going, you know what? I live in Charlotte. I mean, I don't ever get that part, but I get it. I mean, politicians do that thing. So these are these benefits that are always, I will say that we have spent a lot of time in the world of sports economics looking for these benefits because the politicians keep claiming them, and so we'd love to find them. In fact, as I say, I love stadiums, I love sporting events. We want that holy grail of, okay, what is it? What package do we need that would really make this work and that the politicians' claims would be matched with reality? And unfortunately, it doesn't really work. About the only thing we find that really seems to matter on the benefit side are we call mega events. So now these mega events have to be big compared to like a college football game, but not the Olympics. The Olympics that's bad news bears, and we don't want that. But something like a Super Bowl, maybe. NBA All-Star Game, which lasts a full week. A Major League Baseball All-Star Game that lasts a full week. These events that take place over long periods of time where lots of people are coming into town, they're sticking around. The Democrat National Convention, which was in Charlotte in 2012, right? And then I think the RNC is coming maybe in 2020. Okay, so those events do seem to have the positive impacts that the politicians talk about, but they're so rare, right? I mean, how many times do you get a political convention to come to your city? Well, I guess if you're Charlotte, you get them twice, right? within 8 years, you get 2 of them, but when are we coming back to Charlotte? Maybe they're in a rotation, but I mean, they talk about trying to fix Panther Stadium so they could host a Super Bowl. Like, how many times would you host a Super Bowl in 30 years? Maybe once or twice, right? Because so those events that are really major, they do have those impacts that the politicians talk about, but the day-to-day Panthers, the Bobcats, or now the Hornets, or the Hurricanes, those events don't have the impact that are claimed. And so on the benefit side, we're not finding those benefits to be widespread. So again, kind of to wrap up, what our contribution in the book is about the incidence of taxes and thinking closely and carefully about who bears the brunt of the tax, not who pays the tax, because that's really secondary. If it is the case that somebody has to pay the tax for a hotel, but now we have fewer people working locally in the hotel industry, that's a problem. Right? We need to think about that, because this tax, which was put into place to build the stadium that maybe only the wealthy can afford to go to, and then it harms the lower income individual who lost their job at the local hotel. This is, again, kind of the trade-offs that the economists would be thinking about. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to Q&A later on.
So interestingly, Craig, as a Cleveland native, my first memory of tax policy is the sin taxes imposed on beer and cigarettes to build the stadiums, which I love to visit when I go home to visit my parents. But no, there were no real economic benefits from it. So thank you for verifying that. So as the non-economist on the panel, my contribution to this book, and again, thank you to Todd and Adam for asking me to be involved in this, was an examination of pension funding using selective taxation. So before I get into the selective taxation issue, let me just sort of give you the lay of the land about pensions. These are state and local government employees. In 2014, there were about $1.2 trillion of unfunded liabilities combined in these plans. Obviously, there's variation between states and local governments' funded status. That basically just means that there are assets accumulated to pay those liabilities that are a shortfall of about $1.2 trillion. However, if anyone follows the news, the Federal Reserve changed their estimation methodology last month, and now they're claiming it's merely $4 trillion of unfunded liabilities. That is through a use of a different discount rate. And the point I always like to make is that using a different discount rate doesn't make the liabilities increase, it just reveals what the liabilities actually are. And so this is the size of the problem we face. And roughly, not all pension plans have unfunded liabilities. The last time I checked, only 96% did. So it's not a universal problem yet. But the issue that I find of larger concern as someone who studies public institutions and budgeting, the liabilities get most of the press because of those big numbers. But politicians are more interested in annual budgets, which is part of the reason we are in this problem to begin with, because there's not a lot of long-term financial planning. Between 1993 and 2014, state and local governments grew their expenditures about 63% in inflation-adjusted terms, which is roughly 3% annually in real terms. Pension expenditures, though, grew 187% during that same time period, which is nearly 6% annually. And I would just point out that those are the actual pension contributions made, not the pension contributions that should have been made. So that 187% growth does not include what should have been put into the pension systems. And roughly on average, about 8% of state and local budgets go to pensions. It's growing over time. It's doubled over the last 15 years or so. And again, that is only the amount that they've actually paid in, not the amount that they should have paid in. In some respects, as residents of North Carolina, you should be somewhat heartened by your political leaders. You only have an $11 billion pension shortfall, which makes your pension system almost 90% funded, which actually puts you in about the top 5 or 6 states in the country. Frankly, part of the reason is that North Carolina oversees local government pension systems to an extent that many states don't. This is one of the few times, as I was joking with some folks earlier, where paternalism may actually have a role, maybe not for individuals, but maybe in keeping governments, keeping their pensions somewhat well-funded. So in the chapter, I discuss what is a small but growing phenomenon on the use of of selective taxation by state and local governments to fund their pensions. It very much follows exactly what Todd said, that there's a perceived problem with a perceived solution that is sort of targeted at specific areas, and it allows elected officials to say that they're doing something about a problem. Although as I go through a couple examples, you'll see that there's not much empirical evidence that they're solving the problem, much as Todd said with selective taxation in general. The 2 states that I actually focus on in the chapter are the states of Pennsylvania and Illinois. I'll start with Pennsylvania because you already know Illinois is a disaster with anything that has to do with financial matters, so we'll go to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a unique state in that it is a very decentralized pension system. They have thousands of local pension systems throughout the state, and they have a unique way of funding their pensions. Over 100 years ago, they began taxing out-of-state fire and casualty insurance companies, so companies not based in the state. Very easy to raise taxes on those companies that are not in your state. So the state, out-of-state fire and casualty insurance companies wrote premiums in the state, and the state started charging them for a tax on those premiums. And as Adam will probably point out in his talk, or at least it's in his chapter, they then earmarked it to distribute the money to local governments to pay their pensions. So just a very interesting note, the amount of money going into the pension system was not based off of what the pension cost, it was based on cash flows. A little bit of a mismatch. And if you were a local government that was providing benefits that were below the maximum amount that you could get from the state from this pool, you had an incentive to increase benefits to your workers so that you could get free revenue, right? Why wouldn't you cozy up to workers to give them more benefits if the price to you was zero, which is what happened. So of course, we all know how this ended, that by the 80s and 90s, these systems were no longer being fully funded by this out-of-state tax, and they had to start increasing their own tax, selective taxes. So places like the city of York did a public safety pension tax, Scranton did a tax on commuters' earned income. School districts can actually ask to avoid debt limits in the state, and between a third and almost half every year now request exemptions from property tax limits because of pension obligations that have grown over the past few decades. In Philadelphia, they have their own pension system. They did Cigarette tax is $2 a pack. It was supposed to go to the schools. Guess why the school budget was escalating? It was because of their unfunded pension liabilities. The result is, if you look at their funded ratios, they haven't really changed. They've just been funneling more money into it because there've been no reform efforts. While they've been channeling more revenue to the pensions, there's been no reform efforts to actually rein in the costs of the pensions. Illinois, again, similar situation. They have a situation where benefits tend to be set by the state and paid for at the local, which is sort of a bizarre arrangement from a public finance theory, that you have a disconnect between who sets the benefit levels for employees and who pays for the benefits. And as a result, you have things like Cook County increased its sales tax 1 percentage point to have the highest sales tax, I think, in the country the last time I checked, largely to fund their pensions. Places like Normal, Illinois, which is a small town in the state, had to institute its own gasoline tax and garbage collection fees. So those items that used to just be covered by your regular taxes are now being sort of carved out and earmarked so that they can essentially say that they're dealing with their pension problem. So let me wrap this up because I know I'm running short on time, but there are other examples from Charleston, West Virginia, Springfield, Missouri, other states that have increased sales taxes. The takeaways from this is that these tend to be systems that are very poorly funded. In other words, there's a significant public policy problem. These are not places like North Carolina that are doing it. It is places with very poor funded ratios. And they tend to be municipalities that have been unable and unwilling to actually do the hard work, which is reforming pension benefits. If you actually go through pension reforms as a form of budget balancing exercise, very few states ever do it. In the last few years, I've only seen 2 states actually try to balance budgets by changing their pension system. Pension reform is frequently raised as an ongoing issue in public budgeting and increasing common practice. But usually what that means is they just increase what is dedicated from the budget or what is required from employees. It's not a structural examination of the benefits paid to employees. Now, and it certainly allows, again, politicians to claim that they're dealing with the problem. Now, one of the issues that I think is never raised that I think is actually quite interesting is that in 10 states, pension income is not taxed at all. So employees, pay income taxes while they're working, and then when they retire, 10 states do not tax their income, and 11 states partially exempt their taxes. So obviously you have an incentive if you're an employee or representatives of the employees to defer your taxable income into your non-taxable income through time. And we have systems and budgeting systems in place that are more than welcome to accommodate that desire. And the taxes tend to be these other taxes that we've been talking about: cigarette taxes, consumption taxes, sales taxes. And that split between who sets the benefits and who pays for the benefits is certainly problematic and should be addressed. Now, the final issue, because I'm out of time, is this does not even begin to address what is the actual other elephant in the room, which is employee health care benefits, which is called OPEB, other post-employment benefits. Whereas North Carolina has an $11 billion unfunded pension liability, it has about a $33 billion OPEB liability. These are for things, retirees' health care costs. Whereas the pension is about 90% funded. North Carolina actually does better than most states. It's 3.5% funded. OPEB has never been funded seriously by any government. New York City has over close to $100 billion OPEB liability. We have set aside $4 billion, which is referred to as a reserve account by the budget office, where I used to work. So the long and the short of it is, while there are some selective taxes used to fund these pensions, they really are symptomatic. Their usage is symptomatic of much deeper problems. The states and the localities that are using them are trying to deal with a problem that has been kicked down the road for decades, and we haven't even really begun to address the OPEB issue. So officials really don't believe it's a problem, the OPEB, yet. They think it'll be magically taken away by single-payer health care or something. At least that's what I get when I talk to them. But I'm happy to talk some more about it in Q&A if folks are interested in it. It's certainly not something that's going away anytime soon, not because of attempts at creative financing, which really haven't tended to do much. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So in the time allotted me before we get to Q&A here, I hope to wrap up our panel presentations with a discussion of public policy with a focus on human behavior. As economists, we often play the role of policy advisor. Sometimes we think up policies and can advise politicians on those policies. Sometimes politicians think up policies and we have to tell them to please never do that. And then economists also have the role, we play the role at the same time of evaluating the effects that those policies eventually have. And so what I want to talk about are a couple of the policy prescriptions, a couple of the ideas that we talk about at the end of the book, some of our takeaways from the book as they relate to public policy, as they relate to selective taxation. And then I will talk for a couple minutes about why we reach those conclusions. So in the last chapter of the book, we give 8 policy prescriptions. We give 8 ideas that we think can improve public policy. I'm going to talk about 3 of those. The first one is to stop doing selective taxation. If there's one takeaway from the book, I think that can summarize it. I'll talk about that one in a little more detail as I go through a couple more of the talking points here. The second is to make taxation more transparent. So the reason for this is twofold. First, you can imagine that if taxation is being used as a policy tool to try to achieve some objective, like changing people's consumption, making the policy transparent is part of that goal. And the other sort of twofold reason here is that we want taxes to be transparent so people know what their government is doing. We dedicate a chapter of the book to hidden taxes in the Affordable Care Act. We call it absolutely despicable the way that policy was formulated, and it was the chief architect of that policy, or one of the chief architects, was an economist, which hurts me a little as an economist. But he explicitly said, Jonathan Gruber is on film saying that the policy was designed so that people wouldn't understand what was in the policy. Taxes were put into the policy so that the Congressional Budget Office, more economists, wouldn't realize they were taxes. They put taxes on medical devices so that the people who consume healthcare wouldn't see the taxes. The taxes are on the medical device companies, right? But of course those taxes eventually get pushed along to the consumers who are consuming them. Right? So we argue that tax policy should be more transparent. And then finally, if there is this paternalism idea, if government is going to try to change the way that people behave, I think we would all be happy to talk about why that may not be a good idea to start with. But if they're going to do it, we at least recommend that they use more carrots, fewer sticks. All right? Stop penalizing people. Right? We call sin taxes lazy policy because we know that when it comes to achieving a desired outcome, I'll talk about some of the research that we've seen in cigarette taxes, that sin taxes are among the least effective way at getting people to change their behavior. All right, and so if there is a behavior change that can improve this idea of social welfare, right, then use more carrots and fewer sticks. So when it comes to how to try to change behavior, one of the more recent, we can say, innovative ideas, and something that has grasped national attention and policymakers' full attention, is the idea of nudges. Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize in part for his work on nudges. And so in an economist, psychologist, sociologist, political scientist definition of a nudge is a slight change that leaves what they call choice architecture. It leaves choices to the consumer intact, but it might steer them to a different outcome. They explicitly say, when it comes to creating nudges, that the policy needs to be easy to avoid if you want to. So their clear example is if you put fruit at eye level, then people might buy more fruit as opposed to something else. But if you want the potato chips, they're still there. Maybe they're down at your foot and you have to bend down and get it, but they're still there. That's a nudge. What isn't a nudge? A ban, an outright ban, or a mandate, right? Nor is a tax a nudge. And this is somewhere that, I think this is something that frustrates me to no end. The corruption of this idea of nudges being morphed and used into different things like tax policy. Taxes are not nudges. Why are taxes not nudges? Well, if you put a tax on soda, well, then soda is more expensive, and by definition, if you want to continue to consume soda, you have less money. You can't afford as much as you were able to afford before the tax. Right? It changes your well-being. It changes your ability to buy the things that make you happy in life. Right? So taxes are not nudges. Now, when we look at the world of nudges, what nudges seem to work kind of well and which ones don't? One of the primary areas that we've seen nudges applied that do work better than others are areas in which there can be what we call cognitive overload. Because we know choices can be hard, and sometimes there's a lot of information thrown at us. Looking around this room, I'm sure most of you have sat in on one or more employee benefit seminars. There are a lot of choices in front of us. You get a lot of information there. You need to choose health insurance. You need to choose life insurance. You need to choose a retirement plan. Right? When it comes to health insurance, you need to choose a provider. You need to choose a plan, maybe a high deductible plan, maybe a low deductible plan. Are you going to set up a health savings account? Are you going to set up a flex spending account? Do you need a dependent care account? Right? HR benefit seminars are, at least to me, somewhat miserable to sit through. But they are very, very important to sort of the way of life or what we end up taking away. And so here is somewhere where we know that if we overwhelm people with choices, it can be really hard to pick the one that you actually want. And so one of the suggested policies in a couple field experiments that have been tried is, well, how about we just change the default? So what if we set up the default system where you automatically enroll in your employer's, say, 100% match of the first 4% you set aside for retirement? How about we automatically enroll you in that? Now, if you want out, stop by HR, tell us you want out, you can still get out. But the default is that you opt in. Right? And we see similar systems. We know that if we change whether or not you opt in or opt out, a lot more people opt in. The same thing can be seen for things like organ donation and in lots of other fields where if you change the opt-in versus opt-out decision, but you still give people the same choice, they make different decisions. And in some ways, we end up seeing that people end up being happier because they end up having saved more for retirement. Again, a 100% match on the first 4 or 5% of your income is a really good rate of return. right? But the choices are still there. And so what we've ended up seeing is that the idea of leaving choices intact has been corrupted and we see it applied to more and more things. All right? You can't give people big gulps because they're going to consume too much. So we're going to nudge them into making that not an option. That's not a nudge. That's a mandate. Right? We see that with cigarette policy too. Again, if we want, for example, one of my favorite studies that I've read studied how is it possible to try to get pregnant women to consume fewer cigarettes. Right? And again, we can talk about whether or not we want to do that in the first place later, but they looked at nearly a dozen different policies that could try to get pregnant women to smoke fewer cigarettes. And what they found was that sin taxes, a tax on cigarettes, was among the least effective policies at getting women to change their behavior. Now, of course, we know if something becomes more expensive, people will consume less of it. But the rate at which that happens is very low for things like cigarettes, for alcohol, and for these other goods that are often vilified in the public eye by certain politicians. All right, so how can we get better outcomes? Again, it comes back to use more carrots and fewer sticks, right? And let's try to be transparent with our public policy. Thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Okay, good. So we have ample time for some Q&A from the floor. If anybody would like to join in on the discussion. When you do, if you could just please, do we have a floating mic?
You could just speak up.
Okay,
It will be good.
so if you could please just just introduce yourself, state your name, and then let's hear the question.
Garland?
Garland Tucker. Is there a rationale for sin taxes that links, say, the consumption of cigarettes or alcohol or soda with the increased health costs that come from that, which tend to be borne by the whole population these days?
This is actually one of my favorite things to discuss because I think we're moving into we almost need a new definition of something like a social externality, right? So this is actually maybe the largest motivation toward higher taxes or different public policy approach to something like obesity. We know that the public healthcare costs related to obesity are very large, right? They're very large and they're very real, right? And so this is the motivation, right? If you're going to drink a bunch of soda and you're going to end up fat and now you have diabetes and now you're going to be on the public health care system, well, my taxes are partly going to fund that. So now I have the motivation to try to change your behavior. All right? And so what ends up happening here is it becomes it's a very dangerous road to go down because now we're entering a realm where I now have a stake in the decision that everyone else makes, right? And personally, whenever I think about this, it scares me a little because the same sort of thinking can be applied to something like Social Security, right? The longer you live, the more I have to pay. Right? I mean, that's a joke, but I mean, you're very right that this is a strong motivation here, but the economics of it are very different than the traditional economics of if Todd's smoking and I'm inhaling his secondhand smoke here. I'd be happy to talk about it in much more detail a little bit later.
Yeah, I think I'll just add in that the intuition behind the question is perfectly reasonable. And it often comes down to getting the magnitudes right. So in the case of tobacco consumption, people, as Craig mentioned, who get paid to sit around and think about these things pretty in depth, did the measurements and discovered that over a long period of time, cigarette smokers are a net subsidy to public spending on health programs. And it's for the unfortunate reason that they live shorter lives. So they occupy less time as covered beneficiaries of Medicare. So it gets a little interesting when the discussion gets a little interesting when you get the magnitudes right. And as far as we know, economic science has gotten us to that point where at least we know in the case of cigarette smoking, that's what the magnitude is. Could be different with other similar types of things like sugar consumption, where I'm not as familiar with the literature. Roy?
There's something to me totally disingenuous about that particular discussion. You create public policies that externalize internalities, right? It's a term my old professor Roger Garrison used to use. And then you say, because we have these externalities, you got tax people. Well, no, the problem is you've had bad policies that externalize internalities. And so I think that as an excuse to tax people is just actually immoral. And the conversation should be, no, let's get rid of the externalities that have been created by bad public policies, which is the case with healthcare. There's nothing inherent about healthcare that creates externalities. It's only policies where you have governments paying for healthcare and enforcing insurance companies to do X, Y, or Z that does that. And so, there should be no taxes on soda, other than regular sales tax or cigarettes for that matter, or any of these things, because what the policies have done. I just think it's disingenuous to talk about externalities in that way, and certainly doesn't fit into the economic model of externalities, which is supposed to come out of it's a market failure. No, these are externalities created by government failure, and that's the way they should be addressed by economists.
Well said. Can we get a forceful question from the floor, please? Yes, sir, in the middle.
How does our, Dr. Calvary, how does our unfunded pension liability compare to that of Europe? We read a lot about their difficulties. Are they in a similar situation to us, the EU?
I'm not familiar with the EU's pension burdens, unfortunately. My gut is they're probably worse off, but I have no data to back that up.
Most OECD countries do have a similar situation to the United States in their general debt. Some are worse magnitude, some are a little bit better magnitude, and I'm not familiar with the specifics on unfunded pensions myself, but Europe does have a long history of more labor-directed policies. So from that, you might glean that Europe would have a larger pension system and therefore have a worse dynamic liability situation compared to the American states. Yes?
Susie Farrell. I'm wondering, is there a time limit on this if this isn't addressed, when it will explode?
The pension and health care? It's an interesting question. In some cases, yes, when your system runs out of money, eventually, if you run out of money, you can't pay benefits that are promised, which is the case. I mean, it's happened in very limited cases, in very small systems, but it has happened in a few small systems. In the case of things like retiree health care, so when you have situations like Detroit, when Detroit went into bankruptcy, the pensioners didn't get much of a cut on their benefits because they were viewed as protected. So the bondholders took a big cut on what they were owed, and the pensioners survived. But what they did get a cut on was their health care benefits. Something like 90% cut on their health care benefits, because unlike the pensions, those are not constitutionally protected. Municipal bankruptcy is not common. I don't view this as an issue that you're looking at an explosion. What happens is just a slow erosion where all of your budget, where an increasing percentage of your budget goes to paying these legacy costs, these unfunded liabilities. And the liabilities are so large in some place that what you've effectively done is you've hamstringed future taxpayers. So if North Carolina tomorrow wanted to switch to a defined contribution plan, it would have to come up with, roughly 11, it'd have to come up with a few $1 billion to shut down the DB, so the defined benefit system. And it might be a little bit painful, but it wouldn't be impossible. But the taxpayers of Illinois would never, or New Jersey would never be able to come up with the money to shut down their pension systems if they decided that they wanted to move in a more defined contribution way. So these massive liabilities end up eating up budgets, and it removes sort of the discretion of future taxpayers to move in different directions, which I think is a real problem.
Okay, yes, sir.
Ken Somerville, retired research physician. I'm wondering if New York provided us a sort of laboratory. They increased the tax on their soda, I think a year or two ago. Do we know anything about what the impact of that was? And if it actually raised the money that they were telling people would be raised?
Great question.
Yeah, so I've looked into some cities that have imposed such taxes. New York, I haven't specifically looked into that one. But Philadelphia's, for instance, there you ultimately saw that anybody that was mobile, so to get to Craig's comment earlier, everybody that was mobile, they ended up just shopping outside of the taxing district, right? So, and notice who that ultimately impacts. So you don't tend to go buy a 12-pack or a whole case of soda at the convenience store. You tend to do that at the grocery store. And so if I want to change where I'm buying my soda, I'm changing where I'm buying all of my groceries. And so the grocers in Philadelphia ultimately were harmed more than the convenience stores. Convenience store sales were really largely undeterred. It was the grocery store sales. And so that's a much more sizable market. And so it certainly helped. It was kind of a boom to those just outside of that taxing district, whereas it hurt those inside. Berkeley was something very similar whenever they imposed theirs, and certainly up in Seattle where they imposed it on sugar drinks in general. I'm sure everybody's probably seen the picture of at a Costco where they explicitly listed on this, I think it was a case of Gatorade, here's how much we are charging, here's this tax, and it was roughly, I think if memory serves me right, like 60% of the price, right? It's 60% in addition to the price. And then they gave the address of the closest other Costco that's outside of the taxing jurisdiction. And so it's really interesting to see how anybody that is mobile, they tend to shift where they make the purchase and to try to avoid it. And so the promised health benefits for the vast majority of people aren't really there.
But did the amount that they were collecting?
It's falling short. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hey guys, I'm Harry Regal. I work for the General Assembly, do a lot of alcohol stuff. I found something out that's kind of interesting. In North Carolina, we for beer and wine taxes, we share some of those excise taxes with the local government, cities and counties. And for beer, counties get 20.47%. For unfortified wine, it's 49.44%, and for fortified wine, it's 18%. And so my first question is, what's the effect of having the locals receive different shares of very similar products? Second bonus question is, why are those numbers the way they are?
That's right.
I was hoping you were going to ask that because the typical answer is that there's usually no economic justification for a sharing to be 15% versus 18% versus 24.975%. That's not based on, let's say, an economist sitting down and saying this is the most efficient or effective revenue sharing policy. Oftentimes, these are imposed as a measure to try to solve a short-run problem, right? They're not going to solve a pension problem, right? But if they recognize that, you know, if we increase our wine tax by 1% and then give that to the local governments in, you know, that'll solve this problem in, you know, let's say these 3 counties or municipalities. So in terms of, I don't have an economic explanation for why the percentages are what they are, but my intuition tells me that there's not a sound economic reasoning behind them.
I would suspect that the taxes were imposed or increased at different times, and it was more of a way to create a political voting bloc in order to get it passed, right? And so, in order to get the support for a higher tax on whatever one of the 3 items there, trying to say, okay, well, you know, if you can help get your constituency to vote in favor, we'll give a little bit more back, you know, to that lower level government. So it's likely going to be more of a voting bloc issue.
Okay, we can squeak in one more question. Yep.
This one's more so for Mr. Hoffer. I read Nudge by Richard Thaler, and it's a really good book, by the way. I don't recall this in any of his chapters, but maybe you found it in some of your other research. Are there any particular nudges or other behavioral economic ways to address things that may have a addictive influence on the societies they're kind of touching on? Because I mean, you can move things from eye level to ground level or overhead level. I remember that chapter; it's a very good reference point. But there aren't many ways to change things that necessarily have a physiological impact on the body or the brain. Things like nicotine or like alcohol's influence on the body, things of that sort. Gambling, perhaps.
So when it comes to straight up nudges to address any of those concerns, I don't know many. I mean, other than, again, by default, or, you know, by design, nudges are supposed to be easy to get around to allow people to continue to use it, right? So, like you said, moving things from eye level to the ground floor, or even moving something to the back of the store, right? That's a really small nudge to walk an extra 5 aisles, right? But that's very different than, you know, having you know, little hotel-sized mini bar, you know, shots at right next to the checkout counter, right? So by design, the effect of those changes are going to be small, right? So to answer your question, I don't know any large-scale changes like that. Now, I mentioned, I mean, this is a much bigger form of a nudge, but what we're seeing sort of possibly a shift toward are labeling on packages, right? So they keep things in the same places, but they add labels, whether that's a warning label. We saw that and I'm not actually sure if this rollout fully happened, but changing the way that nutrition labels look on all packages for everything, right? To highlight, let's say, added sugars or things like that, right? So these are, and again, I've spoken with people, these are not necessarily cheap to implement for the producers by any means, but these are the kind of things that still leave the option available for consumers, but I mean, again, very few people who smoke don't know that they're bad for you today. Now, in 1960, that might have been a different case, right? And so that's some of the you know, smaller scale nudge changes that I've seen being passed along in either policy today or something that's coming down the line.
And the comment that you made on the physiological or psychological components there, I think, really shouldn't be underestimated. Anything that's habit forming or addictive, I mean, basically, your body is used to a certain set point. Like, you know, whatever your current consumption of sugar drinks or whatever happens to be, your body wants that level now. It's gotten used to it. It's created a set point. And so if we try to penalize individuals to change it in order to get them to change their behavior, if they do consume a little bit less of that particular product, your body's still trying to fight you, fight that decision and get you back to that same level of whatever that item was back in your bloodstream. And so individuals end up, to whatever degree that people end up consuming less, say, sugared sodas, they're going to substitute towards something else instead. And so whether that's be even a rule in your household, like, oh, well, I'm going to reduce my consumption of Starbucks, say, you're going to substitute towards something else. Maybe you buy more chocolates, right? It's just natural, right? And so there's all these secondary consequences that even if we think we found a solution that addressed this one, it's creating oftentimes a whole series of other unintended consequences that are problematic elsewhere.
Well, it's been a wonderful and stimulating discussion, but unfortunately, we're out of our allotted time. I would like to just remind you that this panel will take place 3 or 4 more times throughout the state, and you can follow on johnlocke.org and enterprise.wcu.edu. But for now, let's thank our merry band of presenters.